Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Policy Circle Move the Needle, class dismissed. We're exploring freedom of expression in higher education today. I'm Stacy Blakely. I'm the Executive Director of the Policy Circle. The Policy Circle is a nonpartisan 501c3 grassroots organization, and we provide pathways for women to become more informed, engaged, and effective civic leaders. We want to extend a special thank you today to our circle leaders, our State Leadership Council, our National Advisory Council, and all the men and women who make the Policy Circle community a thriving place that builds opportunities for women who want to lead and learn. We want to thank our influencer network partners, Free to Choose, and Miss Stacy Smith for their generous support of our program today and the Policy Circle mission. And thank you to our many network collaborators for spreading the word about our programs. Today's discussion is the second in our three-part free speech series. If you joined us last time, we focused on big tech and the number of issues that are arising due to the changing nature of speech. Today, we're obviously exploring higher ed, and then the third and last part of our free speech series will be focused on disinformation and news literacy. You can register for those programs at any point, and you can also click and see a recording of our Move the Needle Big Tech Tightrope, which was a really engaging conversation. So if you didn't get to see it, please click on the link at some point. So freedom of expression is the lifeblood of democracy. It's a foundational principle. And I read an article yesterday that said, in times of crisis, foundational principles are called into question. There can be no doubt that the intensity of all the events that have unfolded over the last year and a half have brought questions to the forefront about freedom and equality. Freedom of speech on campus has been a hot topic for a while, but it is definitely coming to the forefront on a regular basis. And now we find ourselves questioning the very purpose of higher education. In a report issued back in 1974, the Yale chairman Van Woodward said the primary function of a university is to discover and disseminate knowledge by means of research and teaching. It's pretty straightforward. And he said to fulfill this function, there has to be a free interchange of ideas, not only within the university walls, but outside of campus. He said it follows that the university must do everything in its power to secure intellectual freedom. And he said that even means unfettered freedom to think the unthinkable, discuss the unmentionable, and challenge the unchallengeable. I think we can all agree that is not typically the sentiment that we hear in higher education today. Last time on our Move the Needle, we talked about a tightrope that they're walking with big tech. Well, likewise, we have enormous tension right now on college campuses between building communities where there's respect and inclusion, while at the same time protecting First Amendment rights. And why are we focusing on college campus? Well, it's important to understand, think of the ideas and the movements, cultural revolutions have started on college campuses. And really, maybe more importantly, this is where the future leaders are being shaped. So this isn't about free speech on campus. This is about free speech for everyone and really for generations to come. And our guests today are going to illuminate how did we get here, but most importantly, what can each of us do? What can we do to ensure that institutions are committed to protecting free speech and that they maintain, that original intent of being a marketplace of thriving ideas? Now, many of you have participated in our polls already, and we'll be sharing some results later on in our call. But take a moment to answer those poll questions because we always like to know what you're thinking about the issue. And the basis for our conversation today and all of our Move the Needles is a Policy Circle brief. And you'll notice that this brief that we're focused on right now is about free speech. And there's a link to that in the chat if you haven't had an opportunity to read it. And so before we dive into our conversation, we're going to roll a video that sort of sets the tone for today's conversation.
At Yale University, a faculty member is yelled at by students.
It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here.
The reason? His wife, also a Yale instructor, had suggested students should be free to wear any Halloween costume they choose, even if slightly offensive. A month later, the teacher resigns.
Let me get this reporter out of here!
At the University of Missouri,
Don't push me, ma'am. Don't push me.
students and faculty try to stop a student reporter from covering their protest.
This is the First Amendment that protects your right to stand here, protects mine.
And at the University of California at Berkeley, when conservative commentator Ben Shapiro showed up to speak, there were multiple arrests, the school on virtual lockdown, and more than $500,000 was spent on security. Even comedian Bill Maher faced student calls to cancel his Berkeley commencement address, in part because he'd made jokes about Islam.
Whoever told you you only had to hear what didn't upset you?
But at campuses around the country, some speakers were disinvited or simply backed out in the face of student opposition. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, head of the International Monetary Fund Christine Lagarde, rapper and actor Common. It's got a lot of people asking, what is going on?
Well, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker because he can tell us what's going on. Why don't we welcome to our call right now, Greg Lukianoff. Greg is an attorney. He's a New York Times best-selling author and president and CEO of the F.I.R.E. Institute. And he co-authored an incredible book. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you so much for having me. I didn't realize that was the video you were going to show. And I was actually the one who took that video of Nicholas Christakis getting shouted down. And I took it to demonstrate what I knew was going to happen is students were going to claim that he didn't act appropriately. And I needed to document, that he was showing almost unbelievable patience. He's an amazing doctor. And thankfully, he's still at Yale. I think he wouldn't have been otherwise. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for having me, Policy Circle. It's really nice to be on here with my friend Nicki Neeley and to talk about campus free speech. I've been doing it for about almost 20 years now, which for a lifelong concern about the First Amendment and free speech. My dad's Russian. He grew up in Yugoslavia, and we know about authoritarianism. So free speech is very important to us first generation Americans.
Yeah, well, I can imagine why having that upbringing. Absolutely.
And hopefully everybody else. So I want to do a quick slideshow just to try to bust some myths about free speech on campus. So if we could start that. So here is the sad little truth of the free speech zone. Believe it or not, a lot of campuses across the country have maintained little tiny areas that are the only places where you're allowed to protest, where you're allowed to hand out newspapers, where you're allowed to hand out flyers. And in F.I.R.E's 21 years, we've been pretty successful at beating these, but they keep on coming back. These are all examples of free speech zones. Up in the upper left, that is University of Hawaii at Hilo's free speech swamp. I literally did not go into it because I was afraid I would get electrocuted. Below it is the very sad little free speech gazebo at Texas Tech University. That's for all 28,000 students at Texas Tech. I had a friend do the dimensional analysis, and he worked out that if, God forbid, all 28,000 students wanted to express themselves at the same time, you'd have to crush them down to the density of uranium-238. And then next to that is the Blinn College free speech zone. It's just that sad little bulletin board. This is in Texas. So we've been fighting those for a long time, and a lot of people don't know about these kind of cases. So let's do the next slide. And one thing that I really want people to take away from this is don't believe everything you read about free speech on campus. Yes. So look at the upper left. This is kind of a typical case that will get some attention. This was a student who was actually punished during COVID because his Zoom background picture was a picture of Donald Trump. They suspended him, they fined him, they wanted to send him to like sort of pseudo-psychological counseling. Now, that's a true case. We fight cases like this all the time. It's kind of a red meat case that people that sometimes conservatives get excited about. I'm actually personally more left-leaning. But the other cases are also what free speech on campus looks like. So look at the young woman on the other side of the screen. She's a student who we're currently litigating on behalf of because she wants to be able to have her own private life on social media while at the same time going to pharmacy school. This actually made it into the New York Times. Go to the left. That is Zach Wood. He's hugging Cornell West. This is a brilliant student who wanted to bring a writer to campus to debate with, to send him into a backpedal about some racist stuff that he'd written. And one of the reasons why I have these students in here is it's not uncommon for these kind of codes that are often justified in the name of diversity and tolerance to be used against students of color, poorer students, less advantaged students. It's a pretty regular case. Next slide, please. As far as trends that I've seen in my career, the scariest one was the violence that I saw in 2017. This includes the riots at Berkeley. That's Allison Stanger to the right. She was someone who was injured defending Charles Murray, someone she disagrees with. She was permanently injured in it. As we cover in Coddling the American Mind, my book with Jonathan Haidt, the Berkeley riots were much worse than you thought. And my big fear, and for at least from the research I'm seeing, is that we're going to see more violence on campus next semester. I hope it's not true. This is a prediction I hope to be wrong on, but I've seen some worrying trends. Okay, next slide. And this past year, we thought we were going to have a quiet year, and instead we had the busiest year of our career. Now, we deal with free speech on college campuses, so we assumed when campuses were closed down that we would see fewer cases. We were completely wrong. As you can see, this compares how many case submissions we received from students and faculty to defend their free speech rights. This past year, we got about 5 times as many submissions as we normally do in June. And it was really unfortunate. That there was one person I knew who got canceled who killed himself afterwards. He was a good conservative activist named Mike Adams, and he was one of thousands of cases we saw. And was that the final slide?
No, but I have a question for you, Greg. What do you attribute that massive spike to?
Something really unfortunate. I'm a civil liberties guy, so I believe that we should have thoughtful police reform. I think we should have thoughtful criminal justice reform. I actually can think of about 5 different things that we should be doing to prevent horrors like what happened to George Floyd from happening again. All of this took place after that horrible video of George Floyd being, as we can now say, murdered, according to a court. The only positive that me and my co-author John Haidt could see coming out of this is like, okay, there are some common sense things we can do to prevent this. But instead on campus, there were a lot of activists who interpreted this as everybody's so intense about racial justice right now. I'm going to go after that student. I'm going to go after that faculty member who said that insensitive thing once. And these cases, by the way, in a lot of cases, these are students who were going into people's old Facebook messages they thought were private when they'd said something sometimes genuinely offensive, but nonetheless in private. So the case explosion, we have a lot of cases that aren't all that political at F.I.R.E. generally. This summer, it was extremely ideological, and it was such a shame because people were taking advantage of this moment to go after their political enemies.
Right. Well, and they were timing even their revenge when that one student that she posted something, I think when she was a freshman in high school, someone held on to it right before she was admitted. And so it's being used as a weapon against fellow students, which is something we'll get into a little bit more. But, I'd love, Greg, and there's a few more slides, and I think we can come to these because I think it would be great for you to touch on sort of the mindset, right? Sure. Mental health issue that has sort of come to the forefront. And I think, Maddie, that Greg has a really good slide that's really showing some of these issues.
Yeah. So I co-authored an article called Coddling the American Mind back in 2015, which eventually became the book. And my theory was more or less that free speech and mental health are connected, that essentially the same habits that make you more likely to want to shut down speech are the same kind of habits that might make you anxious and depressed. It actually makes sense if you read it, I swear. So we predicted a big downturn in mental health, particularly among college-age students, and it was so much worse. Actually, can we bring that slide back up just so we can really take a look at it? Okay, you can see big spikes in terms of suicide. Also, since we wrote the book, and let's go to the next one. depression, plummeting mental health. We actually we looked into updating the stats. We found that women who self-describe as very liberal, who are millennial age, are reporting something like 56% of them are saying that they've been told by a doctor they have a mood disorder or a mental health issue. What's up?
56%?
56%. It absolutely blew us. It's horrifying. It absolutely blew us away, and we're going to be writing about that in the updated afterword of the book.
Yeah, well, and I think that you do such a good job. If you have not got, here's my backwards copy plug, but I'm telling you, you guys do such a good job of really dissecting how we got here. And I think that's such an important question because, yes, there are headline grabbing cases, but there's a much bigger issue.
Yes.
So
and it hit like lightning in 2013. For those of us who are on campus, it wasn't a subtle shift. There was something very different about the students who were showing up in 2013.
Well, tell us what was so different.
Well, the whole book is about that. It's all trying to figure out what was so different. And what we found out is that they're officially their own generation. It's Generation Z. They're much more politicized, much fewer moderates, much more concerned about mental health, much less pro-free speech. There are positive aspects to them as well, as we try to cover in the book. But in terms of the explosion we saw, it was 6 different factors. Actually, we're moving up to about 7 that we thought brought it to a head. But it was funny because people were saying, "Oh, well, when these students get to the real world, they'll change their minds." No, what we're hearing from corporations across the country is a lot of this way of looking at the world doesn't work within companies.
Well, and you see the changes in HR, right? Instead of saying, hey, get with it, here's the real world is bending, it seems, to the mindset. And 2 of the words and kind of phrases you use in the book that really struck me was that, we had built this culture of safetyism and vindictive protectiveness. And you had a slide on disempowered. And I think we popped that up here because I love it when you describe sort of how we get to this place and what those phrases mean.
So safetyism, it was a term coined by my friend Pamela Paretsky, and I had a couple terms that I wanted to coin, but hers was the best. And it was basically about the idea that if you make safety into a sacred value, and you also include the idea of redefining safety to mean emotional discomfort, that not experience emotional discomfort, you create this very peculiar sort of suite of problems, and including, if you think you're always in danger, of course you're going to be anxious, and that what we're saying is when something becomes sacred, it means that there's no trade-offs, that essentially even the smallest increase in safety and emotional safety is worth, throwing out the entire curriculum. So safetyism has been one of the terms that people really seem to get. When it comes to vindictive protectiveness, that was in the original article, and it is this kind of idea that student activists, they're oftentimes not saying I will be harmed if this person steps foot on my campus. They're saying these other people will be harmed psychologically and in a literal medical kind of way, and it leads to this kind of hard-edged, sort of a very self-assured intolerance, which doesn't work very well in a campus that's supposed to be radically open-minded.
Right. And it puts the administration, I think, in an interesting place where they're being told by students who have turned into more or less consumers, this is what we want, right? We want safety at all costs. And so I think that it's interesting how you describe that in the book, because it really shows how we got to that place, even going back to early childhood, right? The things that are put into place. So
in researching the book, I have an adorable 3- and 5-year-old boys, Benjamin and Maxwell, and I learned so much from doing the research for my book. It really changed the way I thought about a lot of things.
Well, and I think you mentioned this when we talked the other day, there's not an easy solution, right? It's not easy to empower your children. It's not easy for administrators, I think, to navigate this territory either. And so, Greg, we're going to come back to you. I really appreciate what you've shared, and we're going to get together again in a moment. But I think it would be awesome to hear now from Karin Lips. Karin's the founder and president of the Network of Enlightened Women, and she's the editor of She's Conservative: Stories of Trials and Triumphs on American College Campuses. She's a contributor to a number of national news publications, and she's going to bring us a really unique perspective today. Hi, Karin.
Hi, Stacey. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, We've kind of teed up what's going on college campuses, but I think you've got a unique perspective because your very members are experiencing these things firsthand. So I would love for you maybe to just describe the college campus landscape right now as it relates to free speech.
Well, I'd be happy to, because it's really changed. When I started the network of enlightened women known as NEW back in 2004, I remember at one of our first events, a feminist professor from the Women's Studies department came to the event. She asked a question of the speaker. They had a confrontation. They disagreed. We all listened. We learned, and we moved on with our lives. Confrontation was something conservative speakers expected when they came to campus and dealt with it, and we all moved on. Unfortunately, that engagement now, Stacey, isn't happening with the other side. Instead of trying to challenge a speaker when they come to campus, we find that those on the left often just try to shut down conservatives. There's an atmosphere that shuts down opposing views, not even giving them the chance to have their voices heard on campus. And it's really impacting conservatives. A troubling trend is the environment encourages conservatives to stay quiet. As you mentioned, you published our first book a few years ago. She's Conservative, Stories of Trials and Triumphs from America's College Campuses. And the book shares the stories of 22 college women and what they face on campus. And one of the trends that I realized in reading the stories from the book is that a number of them made the decision before they even stepped foot on campus to keep their views private. And we dug into that self-censoring a little bit more because I was curious, is it because they just worried about their grades, or was it because of something else? And we found out that, yes, they worried about their grades, worried about grades being docked, especially those thinking about going to grad school. But there was something else there. These women worried that they weren't going to make friends, that they were going to be social outcasts just because of their views. And that's something coming from the environment, which I think is very harmful. One of our students, I'd love to share the story of one of our students, Grace Bannister, who's from West Virginia and is at Harvard. And she wrote one of the stories and talked about how during her freshman year, she was sharing a room with someone who, quote, characterized herself as a woke feminist. And Grace wrote, for the first few weeks, we got along rather well. I worried that this would change if we ever talked politics. So for a time, I avoided it. And then she continued in her essay that when she couldn't avoid politics any longer, she admitted to her roommate that she was conservative. And her roommate attributed it to her, quote, background, that it was because she was from West Virginia. But Grace is incredibly articulate. She got into Harvard. She's thoughtful. She's not a stereotype. But just because she identified as conservative, her roommate and others on campus didn't think her views were valid. So I'd say on campuses, you read about all the diversity officers and trainings and workshops, but all those diversity trainings and workshops just don't apply to conservatives. And Stacey, we're hearing more and more stories from students about their trouble that they're facing from other students.
Right.
So I'm glad Greg talked about some of the university policies that are problematic, but I'd say a newer trend we're seeing emerge is how the students want to shut each other down. Right. We had some students in our new chapter at Dickinson College where they get their Instagram posts mocked by liberals on campus whenever they post there. At Ole Miss, a parody conservative account was started, and they make fun of conservative groups. For example, they compared the new chapter at Ole Miss to The Handmaid's Tale. We've had multiple leaders that now talk about the challenges of being singled out in their sororities. So it really is impacting, every sphere of campus life. And of course, faculty administrators, I think that does play into it as well still. One thing we've seen, as I mentioned before, with all the diversity officers, is kind of a growing number of administrators on campus. So it's not just faculty that we're watching and paying attention to, but also all the administrators. A survey of about 900 student-facing administrators found that liberals outnumber conservative staff by a ratio of 12-1, much larger than a previous study finding a 6-1 ratio of liberal to conservative professors.
Right.
Think about that, Stacey. 12-1, that's a huge ratio. And those are faculty and administrators, who are interacting with the students on a daily basis and are really the face of the university.
And so how do you advise the women in your organization who obviously they're engaging in self-censorship for a number of reasons? I think we had a slide that, 60% said they couldn't express their opinion out of fear. And the self-censoring of themselves, like you said, some of it takes place before they even step foot on campus. But then I think for many, they get there and realize it's probably an environment that could be hostile to the ideas that they hold. So really quickly, what kind of advice are you giving these young women when they encounter these type of challenges?
Well, I'd say we encourage them to think about, how outspoken they want to be. And if they do want to be outspoken and challenge it, then we try to provide a lot of support for them. So whether that's, just the community and new to join our group, whether that's connecting them to other groups. But we think it's important. I mean, college should be a time where ideally you are talking about different views and engaging and you're refining your arguments. You're having those conversations where maybe you do get defeated by someone on the other side. So you go back, you learn more, you get more educated, and then you can engage more in the future. I think part of the problem right now is you don't have those conversations with the other side where you all refine and you might come to some agreement and some disagreement, and that's fine. But just sort of siloing, I don't think is good. So we try to have a conversation with the women, let them know that we're there as a community for them, and then encourage them as best we can to speak out and engage and share with them the benefits of that. So I really think it hurts everyone when you don't have that. I mean, I remember in college going to hear liberal speakers and being challenged by some ideas and then kind of taking those back and trying to think, oh, let me think through my ideas more. How can I think about this? And you learn from it. And I actually think liberal students, they don't benefit from just hearing the same ideas over and over.
Right. Well, and the freedom is to not only speak, but to hear. We're supposed to have both. So I think it's really interesting too, though, when we think about what creates the culture. And so are there any organizations or movements to push administrators to further embrace kind of the diversity of viewpoints? Because there's obviously a great deal of diversity and inclusion efforts at every level of education right now. Is there any sort of pushback to the extent that that's not including a diversity of ideas?
Well, I think there's a lot of groups who are trying to get at it from different angles, right? So you've got the student groups like our group. There's other great groups out there that try to provide an intellectual home for students, some, more conservative, some more libertarian. So I think those focus on the student angle. You have groups like ACTA, who are focusing on making sure, trustees and alums are paying attention to what's going on campuses. Robbie George, is leading another effort at Princeton. So I think there's a lot of good efforts happening because it is such a big problem. And there's not just one problematic area, right? So it's not just the administrators or the faculty or now the students. It's the culture. And I think it's feeding from a lot of different angles.
Absolutely. And social media over the last year, with so many college campuses really not meeting in person, these same issues have just gone into a virtual environment, which
like Greg, we thought last year things might be better on campus, but we definitely didn't see that. I think a lot of the controversy moved to social media and other places.
That's right. And creates even more question marks about what can be enforced in terms of student speech. So I think this is really interesting, Karin. I appreciate you sharing sort of these firsthand perspectives, that the women in your organization are experiencing, because I think that's really important, even as we talk about legal issues and cultural issues. At the end of the day, there are individuals who are not able to exercise their rights and because they're not part of a preferred narrative. So I think it's really important that you highlight that. And we're going to come back and talk to you more about some things that people can do to combat that. And so I think now we're going to transition and talk to Nicki Neeley. Nicki is the president of Speech First. She was the former president of the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. And she recently launched a new nonprofit, Parents Defending Education. So Nicki, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive into another aspect. Let's talk about the legal landscape. And this is obviously a lot going on, even this year. We've had some interesting rulings just recently, I guess last month. So would you give us sort of a highlight of what do you think is going on in the legal landscape, and what are the top cases we should be paying attention to right now in terms of free speech in higher ed?
Sure. Yeah, no, and it's an honor to be here with two. I mean, Karin and Greg are both lawyers, and I'm the non-lawyer, so it's fun to talk about the legal cases anyway. But yeah, there's been a couple really interesting cases over the past few months. The first is something that came out kind of recently out of Shawnee State. It was a case litigated by the Alliance Defending Freedom. And this is, it was actually a professor's speech, but it was a professor that didn't want to call a student by their preferred pronoun. And the professor tried to work with the school to try and figure out, maybe I can call you by your last name. Maybe I don't use any pronouns in class. And anyway, he ended up getting disciplined, I think fired, and ADF ended up, they sued the school on his behalf because Shawnee State is a public university. This case is Meriwether v. Hartop, and Judge Amul Thapar in the Sixth Circuit found that, that they punished the professor for his speech on a hotly contested issue, and it did so despite the constitutional protections afforded. And so that was really interesting. I mean, again, like the pronoun issue, transgender issues are something that's like very much, it's discussed on CNN, but this is something that a university professor at a public university felt that it was just not on the table. So that was something really interesting. And that the fact that the courts stood up and said, yes, like he is within his rights to do that, I think is something that's really encouraging. There was also a Supreme Court case that ADF brought. It's the most difficult named one I
know the Georgia case. I'm not even going to try.
It's Uzabunam v. Przewski. I cannot spell it if you have
well done.
But this was a student at Georgia Gwinnett College in Georgia, obviously. And he wanted to evangelize, share the gospel, and he was confined to a free speech zone. ADF sued the school, and the school did something. They tried to what's called mooting the case by dropping the policy. And so ADF did something interesting where they applied for nominal damages. And so they said, all right, well, we would like $1 to remedy this. And it's something that's interesting because, we find this over and over again in speech first litigation. I know F.I.R.E has come up against this for 20 years, where when a school is sued, they drop the policies and they're like, oh, wait, this is under review anyway. And because they're state actors, they have this deference. And that's something that we have been chasing down in our litigation through speech first as well, because I think it's a bad faith effort. People are paying attention to you. You're in the courts. You want this to go away. And that's something that as speech first, when we sued the University of Michigan, when we sued the University of Texas, that's what they do. They want the case to go away. And the Uzabunam case, because of the nominal damages, has just made it a lot harder for schools to make the problem go away. And so that's something else where it's kind of, it's sort of like a building block to get to, not even to the merits or, but we just have to kind of clean out some of this foundational stuff.
Well, and that standing issue is a big issue because it was a way for universities to kind of move the ball and make it difficult to maintain your lawsuit or get attorney fees, right?
Yeah, and that's also something that's really disingenuous. I think universities have started to figure out that all they need to do in many cases is just to wait a student out. I mean, best case, you have a student suing their school first semester freshman year, and then, okay, it takes 4 years. But then we look at cases like what's going on right now with Harvard and the affirmative action case. That case was initially brought in 2014. And so unless you have some super duper duper senior, there is no way for really serious cases to be resolved in a reasonable time frame. And so that's something that Speech First has attacked through. We're structured as a membership association. And so if we have a student who is about to graduate, we just add a new student. As long as we always have a member who is enrolled at the school, our harm is ongoing. And so we're able to sidestep that kind of the time horizon and the standing thing.
And that also enables some of your plaintiffs to remain anonymous, correct?
Correct. Yeah, because that's one thing. I mean, to echo what Karin had said before, students are terrified. It's really awkward to be the plaintiff in this litigation. I mean, I think about Abigail Fisher suing the University of Texas a couple years ago. If you're an employer, you're a date, and you Google her, you're like, ooh, you're trouble. And so, at the end of the day, students still want a diploma, right? And oftentimes they want to go on and apply for a graduate program, med school, law school. They need a letter of recommendation. Maybe they want to apply for a study abroad program or a scholarship. And they very credibly fear, what are the disciplinary repercussions? Will there be retaliation for this? Although retaliation is ostensibly illegal, how will the school come at you? And so a lot of them just don't want to stick their heads out or their necks out, even if they know that there's been really serious constitutional violations. And so our students in our lawsuit are, they're anonymous. Student A, student B, student C. And that way I get the hate mail and not them.
Yeah, I think you're okay with that.
I'm okay with that.
Well, let me ask you this with this legal strategy. I mean, does it feel like whack-a-mole a little bit, right? We're going to take care of this issue. And then either they've been winning on, sometimes on that standing issue, but that may not be the case after the Georgia ruling. You may have more opportunities with standing, but how effective do you think this legal strategy is? Because obviously F.I.R.E engages and ADF and you guys, and you've had a lot of success, but on a broader scale, long-term play, how effective is the strategy?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a little bit like whack-a-mole, and it can be discouraging. One thing we've tried to do is to get our cases up to the appellate level, because then it binds all the schools that are within that circuit court. And so when we won our case against University of Michigan, when we went against University of Texas, it's not just limited to that one school, but then every school in the Fifth Circuit, which is Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, every school in the Sixth Circuit, so it's Michigan, it's Kentucky, it's Tennessee. So it starts to affect more schools. And I think F.I.R.E puts out their great stoplight guide every year, evaluating about 500 schools around the country on their policies. You can see how there is a smaller number every year over year, that have really bad policies on the books. And F.I.R.E put out a really incredible study in 2017 on bias response teams. And I actually just had an intern a few months ago go through and compare kind of what is the state of play now versus then. And universities really are starting to change their policies to be more constitutional, which is, it's bad for business for me, but it's also good for America and good for students. So that's really encouraging. That I think there is, there's the carrot. We want to incentivize schools to respect and uphold the Constitution, but, to play the part of the stick, because, we're coming at you. And I think, a combination of those two has really changed a lot of policies around the country. So that's encouraging.
It is. And I think, you get some of these because you have so much media play, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that, other schools do not want to be in that spotlight. So it serves as a deterrent, not only in the district, but I think for PR, divisions of these schools looking to avoid some of the bad PR that comes along with this, especially, for instance, that case in Georgia where the guy's just trying to share the gospel. That doesn't play well, I'm sure, in the court of public opinion. So
right.
How big of a factor do you think that is?
I think it's huge. I mean, when we sued a school, I'm not supposed to mention this because it was technically between attorneys, but the University General Counsel said, we would have appreciated a heads up. We didn't like learning about our case from the Wall Street Journal. And I thought, that's part of the problem. You're used to getting endless letters where nothing happens. You don't get a heads up anymore. You don't deserve a heads up. Your heads up is the Constitution. And if you will not uphold it, there will be consequences.
I like that. Can we get a t-shirt? No heads up. But that's key. And I think you're right. It's when there's action, then you're going to get that response. So I think that's really interesting. I mean, is there, in terms of, upcoming cases, or if you're seeing trends, what do you predict? I'm going to have you get your crystal ball. You've got a globe, but, let's have a crystal ball. What do you see coming down the pipeline in regards to free speech and higher ed litigation?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have 2 open cases right now against University of Central Florida and Virginia Tech. So we'll see how those go. And I think also, a big question mark is the Biden administration's treatment towards Title IX, which, frankly, under the Obama administration, they encouraged universities to really overreach on speech issues in the name of, preventing sexual harassment. And so they encourage students to report each other on issues of, on speech things, on jokes, stuff like that. I mean, it all came in under Title IX. And so with the Biden administration wanting to walk back those rules right now, that to me is, that's a vulnerability. And if those rules are walked back in a way where it starts to really infringe on students' constitutional rights, their due process rights, and their speech rights, I know, we've been working with F.I.R.E to intervene in some of the cases, and I know there will be litigation over that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you've got all the different rules that are going to come out of the administration that provide more opportunities for expanding. Is it probably just expanding what is harassment is really what you're seeing?
Yeah. And actually, today there was a case at the Supreme Court. It's governing off-campus speech. It was in a high school context, but it was a high school cheerleader who was off campus after school on a weekend. She used a swear. She was kicked off the cheer squad. And the high school, as well as the Biden administration, weighed in and said, well, yeah, we as a school have a right to govern what's happening off campus. And this is something that we've seen with bias response teams in the university setting, and I'm sure we'll start to see more of, is, anything that happens that you do at any time ever falls under our jurisdiction, which is absolutely crazy. I mean, the University of Illinois, when we sued them, their bias response team said, you could be on spring break, and if you do something, then that's under us. Like, those are powers that local police forces don't give themselves. And to see universities start to give themselves these kind of powers, I think is really creepy.
Well, and I mean, it's just disturbing because it's under the guise of this safety, which Greg talked about. And instead it just keeps making people less and less able to process anything that's unpleasant. So I think this is a really interesting time, I think, with the administration for us to see what changes lie ahead. I think you're still going to be busy. I think you've got lots of job security. I think you're good.
Yeah, I wish I didn't, right? I mean, but I think universities know that they can't just flat out ban speech that they don't like, right? They know they'll be sued for that. And so we see them now using weasel words. They'll ban offensive speech, hateful speech, biased speech. And like that all sounds well and good, but obviously, it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, what's offensive to me might not be offensive to you. And frankly, I don't trust any kind of government actor, no matter what letters next to their name, to make that call accurately. These administrators have huge discretionary power to pick winners and losers, and that should concern everybody.
I think it does. And interesting, Maddie just popped in our poll results. The question that we posed to the participants on the call is, do you believe colleges and universities are providing the right balance of safe spaces to learn and opportunities to speak freely on controversial topics? Only 6% said yes, 71% said no, and 24% said I'm not sure. So I think that mirrors what Karen's hearing from students, what you're seeing with cases, and really what Greg even predicted a few years back. So I think it would be great if we could bring everybody back to the conversation. And thank you, Nicki. And I think it would be awesome for us to have a little bit of an exchange right now with sort of a lightning round of questions. And the one I'm going to put out there first is a little bit more of, I kind of want your opinion as an expert. But do you have hope that freedom of speech can be restored? Can we turn this train around in terms of the culture? Or is this decline inevitable? And I'm going to start with you, Greg.
Yeah, that's the big question. I think that things are going to get worse before they get better, to be honest, to be completely frank about it. I think that free speech has taken kind of a black eye, partially self-inflicted in part by universities that can't sort of admit that they're extremely powerful and privileged organizations. And what I mean by that is that I have to go on campuses now, and I go to high schools now. And what I have to explain is that freedom of speech only exists to protect unpopular minority rights, because, and people talk about free speech like it's the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron these days, is what I feel like I hear. And I'm like, okay, the robber baron has always been protected by the fact that he's rich and powerful. Like any society, robber barons do well, except communism. When it comes to the bigotry, if it's the majority point of view, it's protected too. It's protected by democracy. You only need freedom of speech for minority points of view. But because universities don't really own the fact that they're these incredibly wealthy, influential institutions, they've actually switched an entire generation's way of thinking about free speech, that free speech is the argument of the powerful, which is nuts. So fixing that is going to take a long time. We're thinking about everything from, I'm writing a comic book about it, I'm going to write more books about it. I'm really psyched that Nicki is taking on bias-related incident programs because those actually, they're hard to sue against, but they're actually enforcing orthodoxy. Everything from a national advertising campaign to, but here's the one reason why I'm hopeful for freedom of speech, though. Freedom of speech works really well. It lets you know things you don't want to know about, the problems that you want to hide. And societies that are better with freedom of speech are going to be more successful in the long run. What that means in the next 5 years, not sure.
No, I think that's a really interesting perspective. Karin, your thought, do you have hope?
I want to be hopeful, Stacey. Definitely. I want to be hopeful. So I thought I'd mention maybe two things that we're trying to do to get things going in the right direction. One is, I think one thing we can all do is model that civil discourse. At our national conference each summer, we bring in a liberal and a conservative to debate an issue. And that should be normal on college campuses, but it's not. And I will tell you, it's very challenging to try to find two people to come in and have that debate and engagement. So I think modeling that is a good thing, showing that you can have that civil disagreement and then move on with your lives, right? That's what we need to see more of. And I think that's helpful, that culture, because remember, our leaders of the future are coming out of our campuses in many cases. And if they don't learn how to have that engagement and that civil disagreement now, my goodness, can you imagine the gridlock that's going to be in Washington and in politics in 20 years? It's going to be even worse than it is now. So it's trying to model that civil discourse and then really creating that community, because we do believe these college students, they need an intellectual home. They need a place where they feel free to share their ideas. And if they can't share them on the larger campus, then we want to create that community for them through chapters of our women's leadership organization on campus, and then just being able to affiliate with other organizations. So that's how we're trying to address it.
No, that sounds great. I mean, having community is key. I mean, that's what the policy circle is about, is providing a place where you can engage in complex and difficult conversations and really utilize facts so that you can have a productive civil conversation. And I can't tell you how many places that we've gone, the women are so excited to come into a place where they feel like, okay, it's all right if we disagree. Nothing's going to blow up. We're still going to be friends. And it's remarkable how freeing that is for people. So I'm so glad you're providing that at that collegiate level for those women. Nicki, what about you on the hope front, and maybe what gives you hope?
Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned. I mean, I look at FOIAs of students when they report things through their bias response teams, kind of like the darkness that lies in the hearts of men, where people are asking for, they'll report something they hear, this person hurt my feeling, punish him, kick him out, expel him. And that's, I mean, that vindictiveness, I can get a bad policy off the books, but I can't change those hearts and minds. And so, what worries me about the university policies, and that's why I think, the culture and the law go hand in hand, is when you have something like a bias response team where you are encouraging students to tattletale on each other, I mean, often anonymously, what kind of behaviors are you inculcating in students? You're teaching students, I hear Karin say something mean to Greg. I'm not just, I think it's kind of incumbent on me as a human, as like a citizen, to be like, Karin, don't talk to him that way. That's unkind. But instead, if I'm being taught by my administration, go and tell the grownups, then that becomes second nature to me. Go and tell, go instead of talking to my neighbor if they don't mow their lawn, well, I'm just going to call the cops on them. I think that is teaching really illiberal behaviors. We should know how to engage with people in a constructive manner and not just go and tell on them. And so that's, I think it's kind of, I am a little bit pessimistic. That being said, I am encouraged when I talk to student leaders on campus. I mean, a lot of students who lead groups like NU and YAL and YAF and Students for Liberty, they create these organizations. They go out and table knowing that they will face ostracism, knowing that there will be blowback. I mean, when I was in college, I worked at a bar. I was not politically engaged. And these are people who, they go into it eyes wide open because they realize that, just their presence being there shows other students on campus you're not alone. And that is such tremendous bravery to me. And so that gives me a little bit of hope.
No, absolutely. And I do think recognizing and rewarding that bravery for those students who do step out, I think it is a key thing. And it sure would be nice if they had a little bit more support from the institution for taking on diversity of thought. So, and then I think maybe, Greg, if you want to talk a little bit just briefly about F.I.R.E. and sort of the long-term strategy for your organization, having been really kind of tip of the spear here, tell us a little bit about maybe what that long-term strategy looks like.
Well, sure. F.I.R.E. is my life's work, to put it bluntly. We have about 60 employees. We do everything from legislative outreach to research now, research and polling. We're going to be doing polls of the top, hopefully 300 schools in the country. And what's amazing there is now we can actually, we have a company that can actually get you opinions from campus. You can have the students themselves say, hey, I actually don't feel like I can share my opinion here. And we're going to start ranking them because we think market pressure is important. And to be able to say definitively, don't go to that school. And people have been asking me to do that since day one, but I'm like, I take my social science seriously. So I wanted some real proof other than just you had a bad incident there. But now we can do that. And that's where I really want to go big. I also, I think that we're in a crisis of institutions. I think there are institutions out there that, used to be very good at defending free speech and civil liberties. And I think that it's time for some new ones. I mean, the American Association of University Professors came out against professors recently.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm so happy that Robbie George is setting up his American Freedom Association. So unfortunately, like I say a lot to my troops, business is booming when it comes to defending free speech. And there's a lot more we got to do. But I hope we can also get across the philosophy of free speech to make it accessible. I'm doing everything, gifts from comic books, like I said. So
no, I think that's great.
we got a lot ahead of us.
Well, you know what? But you've got a plan, which is key, right?
Yep.
And so I think it'd be interesting now to take some questions if you guys are game from our participants. I think Maddie's going to pop up on the screen for us, and I think this is a really interesting question we see in terms of this big, powerful institution, and they've had an enormous amount of power bestowed upon them due to COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is every institution right now. But I think this is interesting to see if this is going to make the safetyism mindset even worse. Karin, do you have a thought on this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it reminds me of a story about one of our campuses and what they're facing. One of our chapters at the University of Florida, they were suspended along with 2 other conservative organizations for allegedly violating the COVID rules on campus. And while the University of Florida said it was not politically motivated, I was concerned because I clicked through their statement and there's a link in their statement showing that of the 1,000 registered student organizations found responsible for violations of the Student Conduct Code within the past 4 years, so 1,000 student organizations within the past 4 years, 3 of the 5 registered student organizations listed that were suspended were conservative groups. And it's hard for me to imagine that enforcement is being conducted fairly in that atmosphere. So I wonder how COVID rules are being applied to conservative groups. And so that's deeply concerning to me as one example.
Well, yeah. Nicki, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen, and I've spoken to a lot of students who, a lot of universities have adapted their bias response teams to also be COVID response reporting. So like, I see you not wearing your mask. And much like with the speech stuff, we now see, false reports being made through a lot of these things, or somebody taking a picture of somebody who's tabling when they've pulled their mask down to take a drink and it's in that 1 second. So a lot of these, again, it's sort of like the malicious use of these reporting protocols. And so that to me is something that I think is really concerning. They're obviously, you can't have perfect safety all the time, ever, no matter what. I mean, like you can be at home and so it is, I think, Greg obviously knows far more about safetyism than any of us put together. But I do see a lot of these protocols, I thought that we had started to beat back bias response teams kind of before COVID, and now just to see them weaponized in kind of a new direction is something, I think it's like they're really kind of entrenched.
Yeah.
Greg, any additional thoughts to that?
Sure. Yeah. When COVID first started, when people were, quoting us on safetyism, I'm like, listen, it's a unknown novel virus. It's much more deadly than the flu, so a lot of the precautions we were initially taking, I'm like, okay, those make sense. But did we know that it was going to be abused like crazy? Yes, because it's First Amendment lawyers end up getting kind of sick of being right about this stuff, and seeing the funniest one was NYU actually had the temerity to take advantage of this and say all our doctors now have to go through the PR flags at NYU before they talk about COVID. And we got Nicholas Chryssakis, my friend from Yale, who was being yelled at in that scene, who's absolute uber genius and a doctor, by the way, to go, no, this is not going to be a power grab. But we've been fighting back against a lot of the cases where we see excessive and ridiculous use of COVID as an excuse, just like Nicki said.
Right.
And on the excuse thing, I mean, we did see a lot of schools in the spring put out statements about, you can't say anything about like China virus or any of that stuff. And like, you can't do that as a public university. Sorry. Like, you might not like it, but you can't ban it. The end.
Well, and what's funny is we've seen a lot of cases where professors say Wuhan virus or China virus or something like that, and they get in serious trouble. And meanwhile, China itself loves this. They're playing us more or less. They're using political correctness against us because it's kind of like, haha. And it's actually being shown internationally to be a silly eccentricity that can be easily exploited in the U.S.
Lucky us. There's another winning moment. But I do have to correct you because I'm a recovering attorney, Greg, and my friends that are constitutional lawyers, they never tire of being right. And then I think we've got another question, Maddie, and I think this is a really interesting question, and this will kind of lead us into probably our closing here about what the individuals on the call can do. But guidance to administrators. What can they be doing to encourage this free exchange of ideas? And Nicki, do you want to start?
Sure. This is, I think, one thing that is held up a lot is the University of Chicago in 2015 put out a great statement saying, essentially, this is not a safe space. You have come here to be challenged. And we have seen, thanks to the great work of F.I.R.E. and others, universities around the country adopting this, differentiating themselves in the marketplace. I remember seeing Jonathan Haidt at a Mont Pelerin meeting many years ago, foreseeing a coming split in academia where there's going to be Pursuit of Truth University and Social Justice University, which is like a little bit, pessimistic, but I think is actually like not inconceivable. And I see that in the K-12 setting too. If you want to send your kid to Social Justice Country Day, like God bless, have at. But don't do it with my tax dollars against my will to my child. Same thing in a university setting. I expect one experience and I'm paying you for it. And if you are a public university, you can start to adopt these like hyper politicized things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, we'll see how it goes.
Well, and that kind of goes back to Greg's talking about the market-based approach, right?
Yeah.
So that you're informed. I really wish I would have, known about F.I.R.E. before we selected my daughter's school, but that's a whole nother issue that we're another day. So Karin, what do you think are some things that administrators can do?
Well, I'm glad Nicki brought up that University of Chicago statement, because I think if an administrator is at a school that has not adopted it yet, they should push for it. And 81 schools have adopted it or some version of it. So I think that's a clear sign. And I think that's a good sign to parents and grandparents when you've got, as you mentioned, your daughter, Stacey, when you've got a daughter or granddaughter or son or grandson picking a school, you should pay attention to what are the signals being sent by the administrators on things. That would be something I would definitely look for.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Greg, I want to kind of jump a little bit with you to our closing. Really, we want to empower. We don't want the disempowered parents, right? We want to empower the participants in the call today, whether they have kids in school or they're a donor to their, alma mater, or, they're even parents to younger kids, right? Wherever they are on the spectrum. I think you had told me you kind of have these things that you recommend for parents of younger students to engage in, especially as we look at the culture issue. You want to hit on those for us real quick?
I just hurled myself into the viper pit of K through 12 by coming out with my 10 principles to avoid indoctrination in K through 12, and they're all based on what would once called good old liberal principles. Also, a little bit of stuff we took from Coddling the American Mind. I came out with 10 suggestions. You can find it on Twitter or my blog, Eternally Radical Idea. Definitely, I'd love for you to send it, because I'm calling it a beta test, because I want to see like what the feedback is, and it really becomes, we want to provide a positive vision of what K through 12 could actually be like. And so far, I'm waiting to get my head chopped off as per usual, but so far so good. I also just retweeted the 5 things that I think everybody who cares about free speech on campus, there's so much pessimism about it. You can't be pessimistic until you do at least 5 things that I recommend. One of them is recommending the Chicago statement, standing by students, polling your students. And one of the most important things is explain free speech, explain free inquiry as soon as they get on campus. We actually have our own orientation module, because it's not a normal place. You're not going in there to be comfortable. You're going in there to be part of how we figure out what the real world really looks like. It's a duty.
It's the duty of discourse. I think Oliver Wendell Holmes had that we have a duty of discourse in there. So I like that you brought it around to that. Karin, thoughts on what folks on the call can do, regardless of kind of their relation to higher ed right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think when anybody asks them about picking a school, again, going back to that University of Chicago statement, ask about that. Encourage them, don't pay attention to the zip lines and water slides and lazy rivers that are now colleges are advertising to students to try to get them to go. And yes, there are schools that advertise those things. Ask if they've got a professor who's known as a conservative on campus and where students go to talk and to think about ideas. Try to really get a sense of what that atmosphere is like on campus, and if it is one where somebody's going to have to censor right away or not. And then for those who are, alums and donors to the university, ask the tough questions. I'd really recommend, having meetings with the university, asking questions, because universities need to be accountable to somebody, and they need somebody asking them not those tough questions, because it's very much an echo chamber atmosphere right now.
Yeah, and I think, Nicki, I'll give you the last word on this in terms of what would you, everybody's listening in, if they could do one thing.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think teach your students about the Bill of Rights, teach them about some of these principles, because they're not getting a proper civics education in K-12. And so a lot of students, the first time they get to campus is when they've been told, this is what the First Amendment is. It's like why Richard Spencer can come to campus. Well, yeah, a kid's going to hate the First Amendment if that's their first exposure to it. And so let's, really try and bolster and provide a more robust understanding of that. It is, I think, incumbent, as Karin alluded to, on parents to do a little bit of research. It's when I went to college, it was just like, what's the scholarship? What's in-state tuition? You are sending your child into the lion's den if you are not looking at resources like F.I.R.E Stoplight Guide to figure out what the policies on campus are that govern speech, that govern due process, and Title IX. That stuff is really important. So those are my couple tips.
No, these are excellent tips, guys. What a fantastic conversation. I could keep going, but we are out of time, and we've posted a number of resources. Greg's 5 Things are here. We have Nikki's new organization has been linked up in our chat, and we'll send some of these resources too that Karin, you've mentioned, in our follow-up email to everyone. But I just want to thank the 3 of you and tell you just how much we appreciate your time, your contribution, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all to our speakers again and for our sponsors. And before we wrap up, I just want to highlight a few resources that are going to be linked up in the chat. Like I mentioned, really take advantage of these college rankings and encourage some of the college women in your life. I'm going to get my daughter to do this, the news essay contest, and really dig into Speech First website. They have a lot of things to offer. But I want to say thank you again to all of our donors and sponsors, and for all of you that make the Policy Circle a place where we hold free speech dear. And we welcome conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, so we can build our understanding, build coalitions, and identify real solutions in our community. We'd love for you to join us. We have a link, be part of our community, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Move the Needle. Have a fantastic day.